In 1970, Ruth Buzzi stepped onto the Laugh-In set, expecting another normal sketch. But just minutes later, she said something that changed everything. Her words got the FBI's attention, scared off sponsors, and led to a threatening phone call that shook the show's producers. Now, after all these years, the truth about one of TV's most shocking moments is finally coming out, and it's darker than anyone expected. Back in 1967, comedy on television was predictable. Jokes had clear setups, sketches had logical endings, and variety shows moved at a steady pace. But George Schlatter and Ed Friendly wanted something new, something that felt alive, like the chaotic world outside. Inspired by counterculture movements like Love INS and BINS, they created Laugh-In, a show that broke every rule of TV comedy. Schlatter called it a sensory assault. There were no slow build-ups or time to process jokes. Instead, the show fired off one gag after another in rapid succession. Each episode had over 350 short, fast-paced segments, bouncing between slapstick, satire, and absurd humor. Nothing lasted too long, and the energy was relentless. One moment, a comedian would crack a sharp political joke. The next, someone in a crazy costume would dance across the screen. The show drew inspiration from different places. Vaudeville and burlesque influenced its humor. Ernie Kovac's experimental style shaped its unpredictability. But the biggest influence came from British satire. A show called That Was the Week That Was had already shown that TV could mix comedy with social and political commentary. Laugh-In took that idea and turned it up to full volume, blending sharp satire with over-the-top absurdity in a way that never felt preachy or predictable. Even the show's structure was unique. British comedy used quick cuts and sudden transitions, but Laugh-In took it to the extreme. Scenes had no clear beginning or end, punchlines came out of nowhere, and the action shifted before the audience could react. This chaotic style wasn't an accident, it was meant to reflect the fast-paced, unpredictable nature of modern life. Some viewers found it overwhelming. Others couldn't get enough. Getting Laugh-In on TV wasn't easy. When Schlatter and Friendly pitched the idea to networks, executives were confused. The format seemed too risky, and the pacing felt too fast. Finally, NBC agreed to air a one-time special on September 9, 1967, just to test the waters. No one expected it to go anywhere. But the audience reaction was immediate, ratings were high, and people couldn't stop talking about it. Within months, NBC ordered a full season. From the very first episode, Laugh-In made its mark. Dan Rowan and Dick Martin led the show with quick banter. Guest stars like Barbara Feldon and Flip Wilson added to the mix. Recurring segments like the cocktail party and Mod World introduced audiences to the show's signature style. The joke wall, where comedians popped out of small doors to deliver one-liners, became a fan favorite. There was even a segment called News of the Future, where they made wild predictions, some of which, like Ronald Reagan becoming president, actually came true. At first, NBC saw Laugh-In as just another show competing with long-running series like Gunsmoke. But by its second season, it became the highest-rated show on television. It appealed to everyone, parents and teenagers could watch together. Some loved the slapstick humor, while others enjoyed the sharp political satire. No matter who you were, something in Laugh-In was bound to make you laugh. Dan Rowan and Dick Martin were an unlikely comedy duo, but that's what made them work so well. They started in nightclubs, building an act based on their contrasting personalities. Rowan was the smooth talker, always in control, while Martin played the clueless goofball. Their chemistry carried over to television when Laugh-In premiered on January 22, 1968. The show was fast, unpredictable, and packed with one-liners and absurd skits. By its 8th episode, it had become the #1 show in America. Rowan and Martin helped keep the chaos somewhat organized. Their back-and-forth banter gave the show structure, even when everything else was pure madness. Martin would say something ridiculous, Rowan would roll his eyes, and the audience would love it. Their signature sign-off, Rowan saying, "Say good night, Dick," and Martin replying, "Good night, Dick," became one of the most famous catchphrases on TV. But they weren't just hosts. Rowan played General Bullwright, a parody of overly dramatic military figures, while Martin had a recurring role as Leonard Swizzle, a tipsy partygoer who always seemed just a little too drunk. The show moved at lightning speed, jumping from one sketch to another without warning. Jokes flew by so quickly that if you missed one, another was already on the way. This frantic energy was something new for television, and it changed comedy forever. Shows like Saturday Night Live wouldn't exist without Laugh-In paving the way. Many of the show's biggest stars weren't famous when they joined. Goldie Hawn was one of them. She joined in 1968 as a bubbly blonde who giggled through every joke, not because she was acting, but because the producers told her not to rehearse. Her real, unfiltered reactions made her an instant fan favorite. Just 2 years later, she won an Academy Award for Cactus Flower and became one of Hollywood's biggest stars. Lily Tomlin joined in 1969 and made an immediate impact. She didn't just perform, she created unforgettable characters. One of her most famous was Ernestine, a nasal-voiced telephone operator who made life miserable for anyone on the other end of the line. Every call started the same way, one ringy dingy, "Is this the party to whom I am speaking?" Another favorite was Edith Ann, a 5-year-old who sat in a giant rocking chair and ended every monologue with, "And that's the truth." Tomlin's ability to bring characters to life made her one of Laugh-In's biggest stars and later led to a successful movie career. Henry Gibson had a different style. While most of the show was loud and unpredictable, he was calm and understated. Holding a giant flower, he would step forward and say, "A poem by Henry Gibson," before reciting something absurd or insightful. His quiet humor provided the perfect contrast to the show's high energy. Joanne Worley, on the other hand, was impossible to ignore. With her booming voice and over-the-top costumes, she delivered every joke as if it were a performance. She often sang in an exaggerated operatic style or paused dramatically before a punchline to make it even funnier. One of her most famous running gags was her bizarre collection of anti-chicken jokes. Art Johnson and Ruth Buzzi created some of the show's most memorable moments. Johnson played Wolfgang, a German soldier who would pop up unexpectedly and say, "Very interesting, but stupid." A line that became one of the most quoted from the show. Another of his characters, Tyrone F. Horney, was a creepy old man who constantly flirted with Buzzi's character, Gladys Ormsby. Gladys, a grumpy, frumpy woman, always responded by swinging her purse at him, much to the audience's delight. Buzz's performance made her one of the biggest stars on Laugh-In, earning her 5 Emmy nominations and a Golden Globe. One of the things that made Laugh-In unique was its guest stars. You never knew who might show up. John Wayne once appeared in a bunny suit. Sammy Davis Jr. added his signature coolness to the sketches. Even legendary filmmaker Orson Welles got in on the fun. But the most surprising guest was Richard Nixon. In 1968, Nixon did something no one expected. He went on Laugh-In and tried to be funny. For 6 awkward seconds, the Republican presidential candidate stared into the camera and said, "Sock it to me." His delivery was stiff, and he looked uncomfortable, but it worked. People laughed, and in one of the closest elections in American history, that tiny moment may have helped him win. That year, the country was in turmoil. The Vietnam War raged on, protests filled the streets, and Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy had been assassinated. Nixon was trying to make a political comeback, but people saw him as cold and out of touch. Some advisors thought Laugh-In was too risky, but others believed a little humor could make him seem more relatable. It took 6 takes before Nixon finally got the line right. The show's producer, George Schlatter, rushed the footage out, afraid Nixon's team might try to block it from airing. When it finally did, audiences were shocked, and they laughed. Richard Nixon didn't come across as particularly funny or charming, but he managed to appear relatable, and in politics, that mattered. At the time, Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In was the highest-rated television show, meaning Nixon's brief cameo reached millions of viewers. Some political analysts believe that this small appearance helped him connect with undecided voters, particularly younger ones. The 1968 presidential election was incredibly close. Nixon won against Hubert Humphrey by less than 1% of the popular vote. In such a tight race, every little moment made a difference. Humphrey, however, made a crucial mistake. He was also invited to appear on Laugh-In and was given a simple, light-hearted line to say, "Sock it to me." But he declined, worried that participating in a comedy show would make him look less serious. Nixon, on the other hand, took the risk, and it paid off. This was a moment when one candidate embraced modern media while the other played it safe. Today, it's common for politicians to appear on late-night talk shows, but in 1968, it was a gamble. For Nixon, that gamble helped him secure the presidency. In 1969, Harry Belafonte filmed a segment for Laugh-In that was intended to be a powerful statement, but it never aired. He performed the calypso song "Don't Stop the Carnival," but what made the performance striking was what appeared on the screen behind him. Instead of the usual colorful, lively background, the footage showed disturbing scenes from the 1968 Democratic National Convention protests in Chicago. The images were shocking: police officers beating demonstrators, tear gas filling the streets, and protesters chanting, "The whole world is watching." These events had been some of the most unforgettable moments in modern American history. Thousands of demonstrators had gathered to protest the Vietnam War, only to be met with a massive police and National Guard presence. The violence escalated on August 28 when officers used batons against unarmed protesters outside the Conrad Hilton Hotel. Journalists captured the chaos on live television, forcing the nation to witness the brutality. A year later, Belafonte wanted to make sure people didn't forget. But NBC executives refused to air the segment, fearing backlash, particularly from conservative audiences and advertisers. The footage had already sparked national outrage in 1968, and paired with Belafonte's song, it became even more confrontational. The network wasn't willing to take that risk, and the entire segment was cut before it ever saw the light of day. This kind of censorship wasn't new. During the 1960s, television networks carefully controlled what they broadcast, avoiding controversial topics like racism, war, and police violence, fearing they might alienate viewers or sponsors. Even Laugh-In, a show known for pushing boundaries, had to navigate these limitations. Years later, the show's creator, George Schlatter, admitted that cutting Belafonte's segment was a missed opportunity. It could have been one of television's most powerful moments. Belafonte himself didn't stay silent. He publicly called NBC's decision cowardly. As a longtime activist, he had used his music and fame to fight for civil rights, and he saw this as another example of networks prioritizing comfort over truth. The segment became a what if, a moment that had the potential to make history but was erased before the public could witness it. That same year, Laugh-In took aim at Vice President Spiro Agnew, who was known for his dramatic and often exaggerated language when attacking critics of the Nixon administration. One of his most famous lines, "nattering nabobs of negativism," was written for him by speechwriter William Safire. Agnew had a flair for alliteration, frequently using phrases like pusillanimous pussyfooters and an effete core of impudent snobs. His over-the-top rhetoric made him an easy target for satire. Laugh-In exaggerated his style, turning him into a larger-than-life caricature. Agnew and the Nixon White House were not amused. Reports suggest that his office even called NBC to complain. But this was more than just a joke at Agnew's expense. It reflected a growing divide between politicians and the media. Laugh-In was one of the most-watched shows in America, reaching millions each week. By mocking Agnew, it demonstrated how comedy was becoming a powerful tool for political commentary. Agnew had tried to rally Nixon's silent majority by attacking the press and intellectuals, but instead, he became an easy punchline. His inability to handle satire only made the jokes funnier, and the more he fought back, the more comedians used him as material. This moment illustrated how humor could expose the absurdity of politics at a time when the nation was deeply divided over the Vietnam War and civil rights. Comedy was no longer just entertainment, it was shaping public perception. One of Laugh-In's most famous recurring segments was the Flying Fickle Finger of Fate award, introduced in 1968. This running gag called out people or institutions responsible for ridiculous or harmful actions. The trophy itself was a golden hand, with a pointing finger mounted on a wooden base. It was humorous but direct, a way of holding figures accountable while keeping the tone light. One of the earliest recipients was President Lyndon B. Johnson, mocked for his role in escalating the Vietnam War. The Pentagon also received the award for wasting taxpayer money on directories that became outdated almost immediately. By turning real frustrations into humor, the show managed to criticize government waste and hypocrisy without feeling too heavy-handed. The fickle finger of fate was effective because it delivered serious points in a way that felt light-hearted, allowing the show to avoid outright censorship while making its targets take notice. In 1970, Laugh-In aired a sketch that caused immediate controversy. It depicted police officers as pigs. The Black Panther Party had popularized the use of this imagery in political cartoons protesting police brutality. Seeing it on mainstream television was shocking at the time. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, considered the Black Panthers a serious threat, and the Bureau had already launched COINTELPRO, a covert operation aimed at discrediting radical groups. Hoover saw anything sympathetic to the Panthers as dangerous. When Laugh-In aired the sketch, law enforcement groups were outraged, accusing the show of promoting anti-police propaganda. The controversy reflected the deep divisions in the country. While some viewers saw the sketch as an honest reflection of the times, others saw it as an attack on law enforcement. The reaction proved how powerful comedy could be in shaping public discourse. The show also faced criticism from early LGBTQ+ activists. One of its recurring characters was Tiny Alice, played by Dick Martin in drag. While the character was meant to be humorous, it relied on exaggerated stereotypes of effeminate gay men. At a time when LGBTQ+ individuals were fighting for respect, this kind of portrayal felt harmful. Hollywood had long used drag performances as a way to ridicule queer identity, and activists were demanding better representation. The timing made it even more significant. Just a year earlier, the Stonewall riots had ignited a new wave of LGBTQ+ activism. The community was pushing for visibility and respect, but mainstream media continued to treat queer identity as a joke. Laugh-In's creator, George Schlatter, defended the show by arguing that it made fun of everyone equally, but activists pushed back, pointing out that satire of powerful politicians wasn't the same as mocking marginalized communities. By 1971, Laugh-In had lost its momentum. The jokes and catchphrases that once felt fresh now seemed repetitive. Key cast members like Goldie Hawn and Lily Tomlin left for bigger opportunities, leaving gaps that new performers struggled to fill. Ratings dropped nearly 40%. Behind the scenes, things weren't any better. George Schlatter, the show's original producer, also departed, and without his leadership, Laugh-In struggled to evolve. The landscape of television comedy was shifting. The early 1970s saw a move away from quick gags and absurdity toward humor that reflected real-world issues. By 1973, NBC decided to cancel Laugh-In. Its final episode aired on May 14, 1973, and Dan Rowan closed the show with a simple but honest statement: "We've just run out of gas." Although Laugh-In ended, its influence lived on. Just 2 years later, Saturday Night Live premiered, carrying forward many of the same ideas: fast-paced sketches, unpredictable humor, and political satire. Creator Lorne Michaels never denied the connection. While Laugh-In thrived on silliness, SNL had an edge, using comedy to make a statement. Laugh-In paved the way, and Saturday Night Live built upon it, proving that comedy could be more than just entertainment. It could shape culture itself.